b4. Polish opening. Knight h6. Tubingen variation. c6. Polish, outflank variation. g3. Benko's opening. h5. Lasker Simul special. e5. Knight f3. Benko's opening, reversed Alekhine. g4. Grob's attack. d5. Bishop g2. c6. g5. Spike attack. Bishop takes g4. c4. Fritz Gambit. d4. Grob, Ramford counter Gambit. h3. Clemens. e5. a3. Global opening. Knight h3. Paris opening. d5. g3. e5. f4. Bishop takes h3. Bishop takes h3. E takes f4. Amur Gambit. Knight c3. Dunst. e5. Sleipner, Heinrichsen. a3. Batabang opening. c5. d4. C takes d4. Queen takes d4. Knight c6. Queen h4. Novosibirsk opening. a3. Anderson's opening. a4. Meadow Hay. e5. h4. Crab opening. c3. Saragossa opening. d3. Misses. e5. Misses. Knight d2. Valencia opening. c5. Knight c3. Knight c6. g3. Venezuela opening. e3. Vontikruij's opening. e5. c4. d6. Knight c3. Knight c6. b3. Knight f6. Amsterdam attack. f3. Gedults. e5. King f2. Freiburg chap opening. h4. Anti-Borg opening. Knight a3. Durkin's attack. b3. Nimzovich-Larsen attack. e5. Modern variation. Knight f6. Indian variation. d5. Classical variation. c5. English variation. f5. Dutch variation. b5. Polish variation. b6. Symmetrical variation. f4. Bird's opening. e5. From Gambit. f takes e5. d6. He takes d6. Bishop takes d6. Knight f3. g5. Laska variation. Knight h6. d4. Lipke variation. f5. e4. f takes e4. Knight c3. Knight f6. g4. Swiss Gambit. g5. Hobbs Gambit. d5. Bird's opening. c4. Mojana opening. d5. e4. Williams Gambit. d5. Knight f3. Knight f6. e3. c5. Laska variation. Knight f3. Réti opening. f5. Réti versus Dutch. e4. Perkleisovsum Gambit. d3. Knight f6. e4. Lisovsum Gambit deferred. d6. Réti opening. e4. Bishop g4. Wade defense. g5. Herstrom Gambit. Knight f6. Réti opening. g3. b5. Spassky's variation. g6. King's Indian attack. b4. Reti Smyslov variation. d5. Réti opening. d3. Old Indian attack. b4. Sandusier's folly. e4. Tennyson Gambit. b3. Nimzovich-Larsen attack. g3. King's Indian attack, Barca system. Knight f6. Bishop g2. c6. Castle. Bishop g4. Yugoslav variation. Bishop g4. Bishop g2. Knight d7. Castle. Keres variation. g6. King's Indian attack. Bishop g2. Bishop g7. Castle. e5. d3. Knight e7. Rook e1. Pachman system. c5. King's Indian attack, with c5. Bishop g2. Knight c6. Castle. e6. d3. Knight f6. Knight b d2. Bishop e7. e4. Castle. Rook e1. French variation. c4. Réti opening. d4. Advance variation. d takes c4. Réti accepted. e3. Bishop e6. Keres variation. c4. English opening. g6. English opening. e4. e5. Benoni Defense. b5. Benoni Gambit. f5. Anglo-Dutch defense. c6. English, Korchnoi defensive system. Knight f3. d5. b3. Korchnoi defensive system. Knight f6. g3. Bishop g4. Tor defensive system. Bishop f5. London defensive system. Bishop b2. English, Korchnoi defensive system. g6. Bled variation. Bishop f5. New York, London defensive system. Bishop g4. Capablanca's variation. Bishop g4. English, Korchnoi defensive system, Bogdalyubov variation. e6. English opening. Knight f3. Knight f6. g3. a6. Bishop g2. b5. Romanishing Gambit. d5. Agincourt variation. b3. Knight f6. Bishop b2. c5. e3. Wimpy system. g3. Agincourt variation. c6. Korchnoi defense. Knight f6. Neo-Catalan. Bishop g2. d takes c4. Neo-Catalan accepted. Bishop e7. Castle. Neo-Catalan declined. c5. c takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight c3. Knight c6. English, symmetrical, Keres defense. Knight f6. Anglo-Indian defense. b4. English arguing. Knight f3. English opening. Knight c3. English opening. d5. Anglo-Gruenfeld defense. c takes d5. Knight takes d5. g3. g6. Bishop g2. Knight takes c3. Smyslov defense. Knight b6. Check defense. Knight f3. Anglo-Gruenfeld defense. g6. g3. Bishop g7. Bishop g2. e5. Korchnoi variation. e6. English opening. Knight f3. b6. English, Queen's Indian formation. e4. Bishop b7. Bishop d3. English, Queen's Indian, Romanishing variation. Bishop b4. Nimzo English opening. e4. English, McKenna's-Carl's variation. d5. e5. McKenna's-Carl's, flower variation. Knight c6. Kvitz variation. c5. Sicilian variation. e5. English opening. Knight f3. Nimzovich variation. e4. English, Nimzovich, flower variation. Knight c3. English opening. d6. g3. Bishop e6. Bishop g2. Knight c6. Troger defense. c6. Keres variation. Knight f3. English opening. Bishop g4. Smyslov defense. Bishop b4. English, Kramnik-Shirov counterattack. Knight f6. English opening. Knight f3. e4. Knight g5. b5. English, Benoni Gambit. g3. d5. Reverse dragon. Bishop b4. Smyslov system. c6. Keres variation. g6. Bremen system with g6. Knight c6. English, Sicilian reversed. g3. g6. Bishop g2. Bishop g7. Closed system. e3. d6. Knight ge2. Knight h6. Taimanov variation. Bishop e6. Horde variation. Rook b1. Knight h6. Taimanov variation. d3. Closed system without. d6. English, closed system. e4. Botvinnik system. Knight f3. English, 3 knights system. Knight f6. English, 4 knights system. d4. E takes d4. Knight takes d4. Bishop b4. Bishop g5. h6. Bishop h4. Bishop takes c3. B takes c3. Knight e5. Nenarokov variation. e4. Bradley Beach variation. e4. 4 knights, Nimzovich variation. a3. Marini variation. d3. Capablanca variation. e3. English, 4 knights, e3. Bishop b4. Queen c2. Castle. Knight d5. Rook e8. Queen f5. Steen variation. Bishop takes c3. Romanishin variation. g3. Kingside fianchetto. c5. English, symmetrical variation. Knight f3. Knight f6. g3. b6. Bishop g2. Bishop b7. Castle. e6. Knight c3. Bishop e7. Symmetrical, hedgehog system. d4. C takes d4. Queen takes d4. d6. Rook d1. a6. b3. Knight bd7. Flexible formation. d4. English, symmetrical, Benoni formation. C takes d4. Knight takes d4. e6. English, symmetrical. Knight c3. Knight c6. Symmetrical variation. g3. Queen b6. Geller variation. Knight c3. English, symmetrical variation. Knight f6. Knight f3. d5. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. 3 knights system. g3. English, symmetrical variation. d5. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. Bishop g2. Knight c7. Rubinstein system. Knight c6. English, symmetrical variation. Knight f3. Knight f6. 4 knights system. g3. English, symmetrical variation. g6. Bishop g2. Bishop g7. Ultra-symmetrical variation. e3. e5. Botvinnik system reversed. e4. Botvinnik system. Knight f3. e5. Botvinnik system reversed. Knight f6. Symmetrical variation. Castle. Castle. English, symmetrical, main line with d3. Knight c6. London Defense. e5. Charlotte Gambit. d takes e5. Knight c6. Knight f3. Queen e7. Queen d5. f6. e takes f6. Knight takes f6. England Gambit. b6. Queen's pawn, English defense. b5. Polish defense. e6. Queen's pawn. c4. b6. Keres defense. Bishop b4. Franco-Indian defense. g6. Modern defense. c4. Bishop g7. Knight c3. c5. d5. Bishop takes c3. b takes c3. f5. b-feeder defense. d6. Queen's pawn. Knight f3. Bishop g4. Old Indian, Tartakower variation. c4. Old Indian defense. g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Modern defense. g6. d4. Bishop g7. Knight f3. d6. c4. Bishop g4. Robic defense, Rossolimo variation. g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. e4. Modern defense, Auerbach system. c5. Knight f3. Queen a5. Pterodactyl defense. f5. Ramspringer variation. Knight c6. Kotov variation. c5. Old Benoni defense. d5. e6. e4. Old Benoni, Franco-Benoni defense. f5. Murjana formation. Knight f6. Old Benoni defense. Knight c3. Queen a5. Wawazl defense. Knight f3. Old Benoni defense. c4. Hog defense. d6. Old Benoni. Knight c3. g6. Schmidt system. e5. Old Benoni. e4. d6. Blockade variation. Knight f6. Queen's pawn game. g4. Queen's pawn, Braunstein Gambit. f4. Canard opening. f3. Polyphase attack. d5. e4. Black Madimer Gambit. g4. Gadot attack. Bishop g5. Trempovsky attack. Knight f3. Queen's pawn game. e6. Bishop g5. Tour attack. c5. e4. Wagner Gambit. e3. Yusupov-Rubinstein system. Knight e4. Dury defense. b6. Queen's Indian defense. g3. Bishop b7. Bishop g2. c5. Marienbad system. c4. c takes d4. Queen takes d4. Berg variation. g6. King's Indian. Bishop g5. Tour attack. Bishop f4. London system. g3. Fianchetto without c4. c4. Queen's pawn game. Knight c6. Kvitz-Trajkovic defense. b6. Queen's Indian accelerated. e5. Budapest defense declined. d takes e5. Knight e4. Budapest, Fajarovic variation. Queen c2. Steiner variation. Knight g4. Budapest defense. Knight f3. Adler variation. Bishop f4. Rubinstein variation. e4. Alekhine variation. Knight takes e5. f4. Knight e6. Abani variation. d6. Ballo Gambit. d6. Old Indian Defense. Knight c3. Bishop f5. Yanovsky variation. e5. Ukrainian variation. e3. Knight bd7. Bishop d3. Daskotomirsky variation. Knight f3. Ukrainian variation, Knight f3. Knight bd7. e4. Old Indian, Min line. c5. Benoni Defense. d5. d6. Hromadka system. Knight e4. Vulture Defense. e5. Check Benoni Defense. Knight c3. d6. e4. g6. Benoni, King's Indian system. b5. Benko Gambit. c takes b5. a6. Benko Gambit half accepted. Knight c3. Zitsev system. A takes b5. e4. b4. Knight b5. d6. Bishop c4. Nescafe Frappe attack. b takes a6. Benko Gambit accepted. Bishop takes a6. Knight c3. d6. Knight f3. g6. Knight d2. Benko Gambit, Knight d2. Variation. g3. Fianchetto variation. e4. Benko Gambit, e4. Variation. Bishop takes f1. King takes f1. g6. Knight ge2. Knight e2. Variation. g3. Benko Gambit. Bishop g7. King g2. Castle. Knight f3. Main line. e6. Benoni Defense. Knight c3. e takes d5. c takes d5. d6. Knight f3. g6. Benoni. Bishop g5. Ullman variation. Knight d2. Knight's tour variation. g3. Fianchetto variation. Bishop g7. Bishop g2. Castle. Fianchetto variation. Castle. Knight bd7. Fianchetto. Knight bd7. Knight d2. a6. a4. Rook e8. Benoni. Fianchetto. Rook e8. e4. Benoni. e4. g6. f4. Pawnstorm variation. Bishop g7. e5. McKenna's variation. Bishop b5. Taimanov variation. Knight f3. Castle. Benoni. 4 pawns attack. Bishop e2. Rook e8. 4 pawns attack. Min line. Knight f3. Benoni. Classical with e4. And knight f3. Bishop g7. Bishop e2. Classical without. Castle. Bishop g5. Classical. Bishop g5. Bishop e2. Castle. Classical without castling. Castle. a6. a4. Classical. a6. a4. Bishop g4. Classical with a6. And bishop g4. Rook e8. Classical. Rook e8. Knight d2. Classical. Rook e8. Knight d2. Knight a6. Classical with rook e8. And knight a6. f3. Benoni. Classical. f3. f5. Dutch. Knight c3. Knight f6. g4. Spielman Gambit. Queen d3. Manhattan variation. e6. g4. Von Pretziel Gambit. h3. Korchnoi attack. g4. Krajcik Gambit. Bishop g5. Dutch. Bishop g5 variation. g3. Dutch defense. Knight f6. Bishop g2. e6. Knight h3. Blackburn variation. G6. Dutch defense. G6. Bishop G2. Bishop G7. Knight F3. C6. Castle. Knight H6. Leningrad, Pachman system. Knight H3. Leningrad, Carlsbad variation. E4. Dutch, Staunton Gambit. D6. Benoni Defense. F takes E4. Staunton Gambit. Knight C3. Knight F6. G4. Tartakower variation. Bishop G5. Staunton's line. G6. H4. Alekhine variation. F3. Laska variation. C6. Chigorin variation. B6. Nimzovich variation. C4. Dutch defense. G6. Knight C3. Knight H6. Bladel variation. E6. Dutch defense. Knight C3. Rubinstein variation. E4. Staunton Gambit deferred. Knight F6. Dutch defense. Knight C3. Dutch with C4 and Knight C3. G3. Dutch with C4 and G3. D6. Bishop G2. C6. Knight C3. Queen C7. Horton-Taschen system. G6. Leningrad variation. Bishop G2. Bishop G7. Knight F3. Main variation. Castle. Castle. D6. Knight C3. C6. Dutch, Leningrad, main variation with C6. Knight C6. Main variation with Knight C6. E6. Bishop G2. Dutch defense. Bishop B4. Nimzo Dutch Indian. Bishop D2. Bishop E7. Alekhine variation. Bishop E7. Dutch defense. Knight F3. Castle. Dutch. Castle. Knight E4. Alekhine variation. D5. Dutch, Stonewall variation. Knight C3. Stonewall with Knight C3. B3. Stonewall, Botwinic variation. C6. Bishop A3. Stonewall with Bishop takes A3. Knight C3. C6. Stonewall with Knight C3. Queen C2. Queen E8. Bishop G5. Stonewall, Checover variation. D6. Dutch, classical variation. Knight C3. Queen E8. Ilyin-Chanyevsky variation. Rook E1. Winter variation. Queen C2. Ilyin-Chanyevsky variation with Queen C2. B3. Ilyin-Chanyevsky variation with B3. The end.